Gregory Ulmer in The Internet and Its Double refers to the obscuring of interaction in the digital age as testing the voice that explores a slippage through the multiple meanings of mood and modality. Electorate interactions, having evolved from literate interaction, engage in the same game of telephone as present in literature and the written word. The author writes with an underlying awareness of what each word signifies, though this personal signification is lost once the written work is transferred to the reader. The reader instead engages from the collective or literal understanding of what each word signifies. Electorate interactions, or more specifically interactions in digital online spaces, suffer from a similar inability to derive the author's intent behind each word. However, while literate interactions benefit from being able to correctly identify the author, the anonymity and detachment of digital space further serve to obscure the context of the author online. The obscuring of original context defines the conditions of the contemporary internet. Regulated interaction on mainstream platforms such as YouTube and Instagram employ likes or reactions not as an embodiment of literate human interaction, but instead simulating curated face-to-face social interactions. The legacy mediums of literacy exist in static conditions of subject and criticism, where separation is maintained to allow for an informed call and response. However, electorate media exists in a constant state of flux, or what Gregory Ulmer refers to as post-criticism, where the critical distance between object and criticism vanishes, forcing them to occupy the same space and time. In this superposition, the two are in constant instant communication. The relation of the critical text to its object of study was to be conceived in terms no longer of subject-object, but of subject-predicate, authors and critics both facing the same material language, with critical meaning being a simulacrum of the literary text. Ulmer's theory remains applicable to online content, perhaps more so than literary text. If we apply Ulmer's thought process of post-criticism to the platform of YouTube, then we can conclude that user-generated content or videos access both critical text and object of study. Limiting the scope to discussions maintained on platform, then the official reactions of like or dislike, subscribe or unsubscribe, and the ability to allow notifications or not allow notifications are examples of the shared material language between criticism and object of study. For example, the removal of the dislike counter would effectively disrupt this language and create a schism in the ability of the users to communicate with each other, while maintaining the ability of the creator to communicate. Either intentionally or not, this returns the electorate state of the online discourse to a regressive literate state, where the author is expected to maintain an ultimate ownership of the object of study. This now breached social contract is further complicated by the advent of the pre-video ad, the mid-roll ad, the sponsored ad read, and the sponsored post, which is the broad-scale equivalent present on Instagram. If Roland Barthes' analysis of the photograph and camera Lucida can be reduced to a crisis of the self, then our analysis of intra-platform discourse can be described as a crisis of authenticity. Internet platforms like YouTube and Instagram have evolved beyond their original scopes as platforms for media sharing into global ecosystems for online monetization. The contemporary versions of these platforms confront advertisements and monetization in a similar fashion to the traditional audiovisual mediums of film, television, and radio. Both the content and the platform itself engage with advertisements separately, leading to a potential conflict in audience engagement. For a moment, let's take the example of a generic YouTube video. The video is contextualized by a multitude of factors such as the content creator, the content itself, the platform it is distributed on, and most importantly, the viewer. The question must then be asked, what context matters? Roland Barthes engaged with a similarly existential question in Camera Lucida concerning the photograph. Quote, I am at the same time the one I think I am, the one I want others to think I am, the one the photographer thinks I am, and the one he makes use of to exhibit his art. For Barthes, the photograph exists in a superposition where it is only definable in terms of the observer. Barthes separates the subject from the photograph, positioning them as two independent variables superimposed onto one another. Online content and the reactions they generate exist in a similar state of flux, where the individual audience member derives meaning void of the original contextualization by the creator. The extreme result of this hyper-individualized context has been the advent of personalized advertising, which capitalizes on the superposition of online content. In this way, digital media and online content diverge from legacy media, where advertisements were tailored to fit the platforms and content rather than individual members of the audience. Advertising engages with online content in the same way as user-generated reactions, as they are contextualized by the individual observer as opposed by the original content. User-generated reactions can be better defined as the intended and endorsed means for users to interact with a piece of media available on an online platform. While there are a multitude of platforms available online that allow users to interact differently, for our purposes we'll be focusing on the platforms of YouTube and Instagram. Ulmer's apparatus table, and specifically the row labeled state of mind, is used to categorize and denote the various aspects of electracy in relation to literacy and orality. On this table, Ulmer positions faith under orality, knowledge under literacy, and fantasy under electracy. The states of mind of faith and knowledge are both tied to an external assurance via a higher authority, whether figurative in a god figure or literal in the sense of an experienced academic. Fantasy, on the other hand, is tied to the self. Expanding on Barthes' examination of the photograph relative to the observer, Ulmer positions the electorate object as intrinsically tied to the self. The electorate object is therefore not tied to any given location, but rather its conceptualization within the mind of the observer. Dr. Sarah Arroyo connects electracy to the contemporary internet, saying, "From the perspective of electracy, dynamic sites such as YouTube are a part of a complex network, creating communities by leaping out of their platforms and residing in countless digital spaces." This act of leaping out describes inter-platform discourse, where a piece of original content is taken from one platform to another without necessarily changing as would be expected with remix. However, intra-platform discourse is defined by either the use of regulated platform interactions, to like, to subscribe, to comment, or through the act of traditional remix. Focusing on instances of the former, Arroyo comments on subscribing. The act of subscribing, then, is something prolific YouTubers hold as almost a sacred move. It notifies users anytime their subscriptions have been active on YouTube, and it creates what they call the quote-unquote YouTube community, which distinguishes the site from other video sharing sites. For social media platforms like YouTube and Instagram, the subscribe button or follow button, for the latter example, serve a dual purpose as analytical markers of user interaction and social markers of belonging to a particular discourse community or channel/user. Participation in these discourse communities is vital to the formation of online identity, as both the individual user and the larger YouTube channel exist in a symbiotic relationship. Any violation of this social contract, like the subscribing scheme of user Peach of Meat explored by Dr. Arroyo, calls into question the official means of interacting on these platforms. In the example of Peach of Meat, it was a user who broke an unofficial rule of the larger community, acting in bad faith and breaching the social contract between user and user. What happens when the platform acts in bad faith and breaches the social contract between user and platform? On November 10th, 2021, YouTube rolled out an update and accompanying blog post titled "An Update to Dislikes on YouTube." And within this post they explained, quote, "We're making the dislike counts private across YouTube, but the dislike button is not going away." Instagram announced a similar option to allow users to hide the like counters on their posts on May 26th, 2021. In both cases, a major social media platform chose to obscure user-generated reactions, making it increasingly difficult to gauge what is signified by a particular reaction. Does the dislike carry the same weight when you can't see it? Online discourse is built on a foundation of authentic engagement, despite the myriad of actors with differing motivations. This authentic engagement is achieved through official reactions, though their purpose differs depending on the observer. The corporate actor or sponsor may view official reactions like likes or subscriptions from a utilitarian perspective as a measure of active engagement with a product. This is a well-known stick for the modern internet, and while originally it might have made sense to obscure this utilitarianism, transparency has a more positive connotation. In the example of YouTuber Peach of Meat, the user's unsavory exploitation was viewed as such only after he exposed his own actions, quote, "Because Peach of Meat did not attempt to engage his subscribers by uploading content in which they may be interested, and instead posted a video boasting about what he had done, he instantly became demonized." Despite Peach of Meat admitting that he had erroneously gained subscribers, he is still vilified for doing so. The authenticity of the internet is not just about truthfulness, but about a perception of honesty. In a paper exploring authenticity online as it relates to customer engagement, Anniek Eigenraam, writing on brand perception, states, "To consumers, brands do not merely entail features and benefits of products. Brands are also social entities to interact with and build a relationship with. Brands are personified and viewed in equal terms to that of a human user. Therefore, the informal rules remain for brands and human users alike. If a brand or corporate entity engaged in the practices of buying fake views or likes in order to build a false perception of pre-existing engagement, they would face a similar ostracization as user Peach of Me. Later in this set of studies, Eigenraam and her team concluded that broadly, consumers expect and are more appreciative of engagement initiatives that are authentic for the brand. Authenticity is therefore more subjective than originally thought, subject to the same user-centric relativity as Barthes' photograph and Ulmer's post-critical object. Online authenticity is less a stringent set of rules to be followed and more akin to linguistic dialects. The signifier, the like button, takes on drastically different connotations depending on both the intended audience and the actual observer. And like dialects of a similar language, online intra-platform discourses share a common alphabet in the form of sanctioned interactions like the like. Therefore, the removal of the dislike counter on YouTube and the option to hide the like counter on Instagram fundamentally changes both the meaning behind and methodology of platform discourses. The larger YouTube community has adapted to this change through the creation of third-party tools to simulate the dislike counter, but it pales in comparison to a lack of an official means to express collective distaste. The removal of the dislike counter creates a divide between the collective and the individual, where the latter is unable to gauge their actions relative to the larger collective. The most extreme case of this would be dislike attacks, defined by YouTube as an event where people would work to drive up the number of dislikes on a creator's video. Like any form of language, the dislike is subject to abuse and intentional misappropriation, which formed the official basis for the counter's removal in November of 2021. However, online discourse, and by extension the identities of its user base, are actively defined relative to their ability to effectively communicate through official means. This ability to communicate is entirely dependent on what the platform makes available, but it is also dependent on the user's relationship to the content. Studying commercial content, Eigenraam pointed to, quote, brand worth, referring to perceived intentions of a brand, evaluating to what extent a brand consistently acts with the public's best interest in mind, as a major contributing factor to how consumers gauge their perceptions of online content. Content creators, whether group actors or individuals, are expected to both fit the perceptions of the platform and simultaneously act within their previously performed image. Likewise, the same expectation is there for the casual user, as the use of the social media platform comes with the unwritten expectation of active engagement through interaction and reaction. As suggested previously, while the like is a positive interaction that signals the user's response, it remains highly contextual. Measuring this positive interaction is a matter of metric engagement for the corporate actor who identifies user engagement with the posted product. However, the casual user better understands it as a relationship marker, positioning it not as an engagement with a particular post, but rather the poster. In a study on the presence of moral obligation and social interaction online, Jishu and their colleagues based their research on symbolic interactionism. In online social interaction among acquaintances, the affective and relational patterns of communication are relatively similar to face-to-face communication because users still have a need to maintain relationships. They should not only look at the online information, but also focus on the static and dynamic cues from the social environment. As opposed to face-to-face interaction, which is contextualized by a single present social environment, electorate interaction is hyper-contextualized by not only the social environments of the individual users, but the larger digital platform as well. For that reason, the removal of the dislike counter on YouTube and the option to hide the like count on Instagram hampers the ability of the user to maintain online relationships. If the user is meant to receive feedback or recognition of their interaction, then its removal calls into question their identity. Jishu's study has concluded that, quote, perceived closeness has the strongest direct effect and total effect on like intention, whereas perceived authority has the strongest indirect effect. It is not groundbreaking to suggest that user familiarity is a strong factor in determining positive interaction, but it is notable that it plays a role in user intent to interact. suggesting that the motivation to interact is not based on the particular content of the post, but rather on who is doing the posting. Drawing once more on Ulmer's apparatus table, the states of mind for orality, literacy, and electracy are as follows: faith, knowledge, and fantasy. These states of mind are encapsulated in online social interaction, as mediated through official reactions like the like. The use of these reactions on platforms like YouTube and Instagram simulate face-to-face interactions, where the individual users are contextualized by both their own social environments and the larger discourse community that they find themselves within. Beyond this, the studies of Eigenraam and Shu position authenticity presented through brand worth and user familiarity, respectively, as major contributing factors to how users interact with online content. Previous platform actions of YouTube and Instagram have jeopardized the ability for users to effectively communicate with each other via intra-platform discourse. These actions forcibly shift electorate interaction from a collective action to an individual one, more akin to literate interaction, where there is a maintaining of distance between criticism and object of study. The grander implication, of course, is that online discourse is an evolution of face-to-face interaction, now further contextualized by the environments of all actors simultaneously. Online discourse is more akin to Ulmer's concept of post-criticism, as it is not limited by space and time, but rather artificial limitations of intra-platform interaction.